Hello and welcome to the Common Weal Policy Podcast. I'm Dr. Craig Gale. I'm the Head of Policy and Research at Common Weal. This week, I'm joined by Leo Plumb, Common Weal's newest member of staff, our new Networks Coordinator. Leo has a long history of political campaigning, particularly at a community level, and he has joined Common Weal to help us reach out to our activists and volunteers and to empower them in helping us spread our policy papers, our policies and our campaigns, and to help them in their own local campaigns. Leo, welcome. First, tell us about yourself and your background in campaign organisation.
Sure thing. Well, I'm really pleased to be joining the Common Weal team, and I'm excited to get stuck in for the next few weeks and months. So I live in Glasgow. I've been here for about 6 years. Lived in Leeds before that. My campaigning experience I came to quite slowly in my life. I grew up in a family that was quite political, I guess. I had mum and dad that would talk about unions, trade unions and stuff, and I never really understood what that meant. Found it quite confusing when I was young. And a lot later in life, I got involved a little bit more politically active, I guess, around the time that the Tories were trying to introduce curbs on trade union powers, or powers of trade union workers to organise. And that was quite fundamental for me. So I remember going to demonstration in Manchester when I'd sort of finished uni, meeting people who knew a lot more about trade union organising than me, but being introduced to this big fundamental change that was being proposed. That was very, very worrying for the communities of workers, to be able to organise and fight for better terms and conditions and pay and stuff. And I guess even after that, I still was confused and didn't know a lot about what organising meant or that kind of thing. I ended up in Glasgow, which was great. I moved up here with my girlfriend. And after being here for a little while, I was working in community centres, and I got to meet a lot of the people that ran the community centres, the buildings themselves, effectively sort of janitors, but they had a different title. They were called leisure attendants. And I was speaking to them a lot about their working conditions. And even at that point, when they were, having a very difficult time, I still wasn't kind of driven myself to get involved in action around it. And it was only later that I really came to want to be involved in being a member of kind of political movements or activist groups because of housing issues. Effectively, I was working for a charity with young people who are from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, and that was here in Glasgow in Pollokshields. And I came to understand at that time there were a lot of issues going on with the asylum seeker and refugee communities in trying to basically access housing. And at around that time, a big organisation in Scotland, Serco, big contractor that lots of people will be familiar with, was saying that they were going to evict 300 asylum seekers. That was just something that really I found terrifying. And I think, like a lot of people in Glasgow, I got involved in a movement to try and support those individuals and basically just get involved in campaigns to prevent those evictions. So it was kind of through that I met a lot of people who are just pretty fantastic campaigners and leaders in their own right. And I got involved in struggles to do with housing as more widely around private renting and social housing. And I'd eventually ended up in a number of different roles, helping out with different campaign groups. And I've been a member of the Labour Party, so I've always campaigned, for the last few years in that way. But I found myself thinking a lot more about how political parties interact with community groups, not so much to do with politicians and more to do with like activists and their community networks that they've got. So that's my sort of interest in how I've ended up at this point here.
And Scotland's certainly a country that's had no shortage of history with that kind of community organisation. It has historically been a very powerful aspect of politics. And you're right, it's something that interests me in that regard, that how you can get politics done at something other than the political party and the politician level. Which is why I got you onto the show this week to kind of talk about that. Can you mention something about that history that Scotland has, and some notable examples of community organisation that have kind of inspired you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like you say, Scotland's got an incredibly radical history. I can't at all say that I'm an expert on the history in Scotland. And I kind of get a lot of the things I learn are from great kind of other activists and organisers sharing little things on social media, just little snippets of history that are really exciting. So I'm obviously, soon into living in Scotland, I came to know about kind of things like Red Clydeside, and involved in the housing struggles, in particular Mary Barber and the rent strikes the early last century. So really those are the principal kind of things that have made me want to know about more that happened in the intervening years. And it's been a pretty exciting, certainly I know a lot of my knowledge is I guess of what happened in Glasgow and to do with housing. There's a great lot of movements that popped up in the 60s, 70s and 80s in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh that were around housing related issues. So there's sort of post-war new build estates or schemes that people moved out to. A lot of the people that were suddenly found themselves living in those places like Easterhouse in Glasgow or like Muirhouse in Edinburgh were suddenly confronted by the fact that they had, very little amenities in the local area, and it hadn't been planned out. And where they might have been optimistic about moving to those places, they then found that the only real way to draw attention to the fact that they felt quite underrepresented and forgotten about was to locally organise and campaign locally. So a lot of those issues that they thought about, Muirhouse is a good example. They were fighting against kind of increasing problems with dampness in the scheme and in the housing that was causing health problems and other things. In Easterhouse, it was just about getting local services and amenities, trying to get primary schools so that their children could actually go to school. And there's a great book, which I've got to be honest, I've not read all of it, but it's brilliant, by Cathy McCormack, which is called The Wee Yellow Butterfly, about being a resident in Easthouse or in the East End of Glasgow and what it took to try and bring communities together to actually try and fight for some basic needs. More recently, I guess, still relating to housing, but also to do with asylum seekers and refugees. There's been some absolutely outstanding campaigns launched that were totally grassroots amongst residents. So things like opposing the Dawn raids, now a decade ago, whatever, where groups of residents and tenants, particularly as people who are from Black and ethnic minorities, but people who'd experienced asylum or coming to the UK, coming to Scotland for the first time, were getting together in order to stop the eviction of people from their homes. And we've seen that type of campaigning carry on and on and on in recent years, and something that I've observed and been part of and really enjoyed, that campaigning against the eviction of people from their homes effectively. And we had last year in Glasgow the Kenmure St protests or intervention to stop the Home Office from evicting people. I think that's a fantastic example of the most recent current events around that type of activism.
Yeah, I mean, I was at that Kenmure St demonstration last year, and while I'm not part of that community, I was one of the hundreds of people that flocked in to help support that community, and that demonstration started as neighbours looking after their own neighbours before it became bigger than that. So it was wonderful to see, and it was wonderful to see how that was resolved over the course of the day. Although I have to say, slightly terrifying when you consider how it could have gone when you saw just around a block or two around that protest, the number of heavily armed police getting ready for potentially a riot level response to that protest.
I was really struck in the weeks afterwards by how much there was a big morale boost and an energy boost amongst people who are, I suppose, a bit politically minded in Glasgow and beyond. The discussions were constantly referring back to that, and I think people took a lot of learning from the moment of confrontation between very embedded communities that, it highlighted just how well communities were actually working together, and those state actors that were involved as well. So very important thing to continue to reflect on, even though it only happened last year.
Mm. So is there anything else in modern Scotland, or even more broadly than that you'd like to point people to as an example, both in terms of, because there's kind of two ways that communities can organise for change. There's the kind of idea of stopping something bad happening to the community, neighbours getting evicted, or one campaign local to me is trying to prevent a waste incinerator being built just outside the village. I had the organisers for that campaign on the podcast last year. I'll put a link to that in the description. But you also have the second type of political campaigning, which is building something good, taking what you have and making it better through the power of community organisation. And I know that we've spoken offline about things like the famous Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016.
Yeah. So yeah, it's good to mention the negatives and the positives. It's hard not to factor in the backdrop to kind of what's going on. So big decade of decline in Scotland and the rest of the UK. Pandemic came, hit everybody, crashing blow. We're seeing the repercussions of years of our industrial base getting sold off, and industries being bought in, as your kind of coverage of the renewable sector and energies is clearly making clear at the minute. And yet there are some really good types of organising and communities reacting to that backdrop and fighting for either local change or for bigger issues. And so I agree with you. I think some of it's like, people fighting for municipal services. That is a very healthy discussion around transport. Can we bring buses into public ownership or local ownership? That's clearly a kind of fundamental gain if Scotland can move towards that. And we've got quite a lot of different groups working at least in solidarity with each other, if not kind of building coalitions to try and achieve things like that in certain places. That's key, because transport is one of them things where if you can move from one place to another, it's a route to try to get out of situations of poverty and inequality. If we can at least go to see our friends and go to see people get the healthcare we need by going, to the next region to be able to do it. And I think the 2021 election, political parties were spending a lot of their time kind of dismissing the other parties and saying, who's more divisive, who's ignoring certain issues and not speaking about it. And yet at the same time, there were certain campaign groups that were using, I suppose, a different route to speak about things that they felt were just incredibly urgent at that time. So I was working in the northeast of Scotland during that period, and there was great work being done around campaigning against the drug deaths in Scotland, people's lives potentially ruined by addiction and just soaring levels of health problems as a result of that really being brought to the attention. You had kind of fights over guaranteeing sick pay for workers. I think there was a lot of really good organising around that, although I understand, the powers for that, a lot of those are based in Westminster and not necessarily Scotland. But yeah, a lot of kind of a lot of discussion and organising around community ownership off the back of the Community Empowerment Act, and there's groups organising at very small levels to try and take over community hubs, community centres, in order to make those run through the local communities with a sense of ownership from local people. And that's a long-term bit of work, but there's some hope there to see what can come out of that kind of thing. I also was just really enthused to see younger generations organising quite a lot. And I do get the feeling that activists are being developed by leaders of previous generations as well. So sort of teaching people how to be leaders or how to be community organisers. That's happening through kind of reinvigoration of the unions, trade unions, but it's also just great to see sort of young groups of people campaigning for stuff all around Scotland, including in the Highland and Islands as well. So yeah, we're entering a very interesting period now, and we've got some struggles and some organising which is reinvigorating past fights. So this year we've got a reinvigoration of the campaign around equal pay for workers in Glasgow councils. Yeah, as I mentioned before, continuing struggles to do with housing. And there's also a lot come off the back of COP26. Too much to go into really in terms of all the different groups organising around a green agenda, but lots of them you've mentioned or spoken about in previous podcasts as well.
What are the main barriers that communities face when it comes to making these calls for, or get what they need, either the resources to mount a campaign, or even just the voice to make themselves heard?
So that's a really interesting question. I think it comes down to a little bit how you would term a community. I think it's quite useful to think about community in its smallest and largest scales. So community could be, as I said, residents living on one street, or all the people working at a particular level of one commercial business. It could be, do you know what I mean? So within that, I think the thing that people really need to recognize at the moment is basically just the pressures that face individuals are huge. Some of the reasons for that I already mentioned as well, but things like the pressure of personal finances, just being able to get by. We've got a cost of living crisis right now, but people also have a lot of pressure in terms of their time. So if anybody is listening, is thinking about how they're going to get to doctor's appointments and get their healthcare sorted, or if you've got a kid, I've got a young boy who's 2, just how to get nursery application in and what that'll mean, caring for elderly relatives. Those kind of pressures on people are enormous, and so people end up fighting a lot just to try and get their basic needs met. And I think that means that communities more widely face the problem of organising, because it's actually hard to make organising accessible to people. So sometimes you get this view that people say, "Oh, people around here are really apathetic. They just don't care enough to make change happen." And I think as a community organizer, what other people have showed me and taught me is that actually we've just not maybe convinced them yet that organising is one way to make that change happen. But still, in order to get people's material needs met first, it is essential to make it possible for them to engage. But yeah, people feeling disconnected also comes to a bigger question, which is about people feeling unable to see how those people that hold power should be accountable, and even who those bodies or organizations or structures are. So people who do get involved in campaigning locally should be, through that campaigning, should be able to see the structures of accountability, who has power. And it's been said loads and loads of times, including, amongst our staff team, but people in power are very afraid when they see that groups understand how to leverage that power. If, like you were saying about campaign against a local incinerator, if the actors who are in favour of that incinerator start to see their allies actually speak up and side with local groups who are against it, those proponents for a local incinerator then begin to feel a bit weak and more powerless. And as that power shifts, that's how you can kind of counteract the barriers, I think, that communities face.
I've certainly had personal experience of at least one politician. I wouldn't mention who they were or where they came from, but their attitude towards representational politics was, you can hold me to account at elections. In between elections, you have no say whatsoever, and I will do what I like. If you don't like what I did between now and the next election, you can vote me out then. Well, we did. But what you were saying there about the quote unquote apathy in communities, and you're right. There's a lot in that on people just trying to meet their basic needs. What you need to have yourself on a relatively secure footing before you can even think about doing a lot of this. But is there a confidence barrier as well, in that people might just think, I am just a small voice going up against the large and powerful. Will this work?
Yeah, that confidence barrier definitely exists. It exists when you speak to people about the potential of organising. And I use that word a lot already. I know that seems quite wishy-washy, but effectively organising is about building power. And so whenever you talk about power, people feel a bit afraid. They're like, oh, politics isn't for me. I don't engage at that level. That's scary stuff you're talking about there. But I think breaking down that confidence barrier is really, really important. If there are any kind of fledgling groups or groups involved in local activism and organizing like that to build power, the first thing they need to do in order to encourage people's confidence to get involved, I think, is to try and win small victories. So it's one of the big mistakes that a lot of the times happens, is that small campaign groups will try and go for the big issue. But effectively, if there's something that is widely felt and deeply felt as an issue, and is easy to understand, and has a clear decision maker, a clear opponent, perhaps, then that's something that's feasible as a particular issue that can be won. And once those small victories are achieved by a group of people, that has the capacity to expand people's horizons about what can be achieved. So people need to see real improvement made through a particular campaign. Real alternatives posed through the actual campaign, and sometimes those can be posed through the tactics taken as well. I mentioned in an article last week about a campaign by Living Rent and the GMB union around cleansing workers and fighting for their terms and conditions. So those are the people that clear up the mess on our streets, effectively, or in our back courts of our houses, like the tenements that I live in. There was a big campaign around that during COP26. And one of the actions that was taken by Living Rent, Scotland's tenants union, who I've been involved with in the past, and the GMB union, was to illustrate how much rubbish had collected during COP26. So there was a big cleanup, like your sort of friendly community cleanups that happen in neighbourhoods, but that rubbish was then delivered and dumped in George Square outside the city chambers in Glasgow. And it's that actual people participating in an action and then illustrating what the problem is that just highlights what the change is that needs to be happened. And just going back to that, in order to kind of show real improvement in people's lives through those small victories, organizations from trade unions to community activist organizations need to fight for small victories first and then scale up. If you've got, like, for example, people that work in the train transport unions fighting to get a second conductor, a second driver on the trains, if they can win that, it not only is a real improvement in their lives, but it also would set a standard by which the transport companies are then held to account after that. Do you know what I mean? There's a safety standard implemented. And I think the other thing about overcoming the confidence barriers is that in order to build that power or do effective community organizing, it needs to be a lot of the time about developing leaders. And some people who are community organizers would say that is the fundamental purpose of community organizing. And I don't mean leaders like people who potentially stand for elections in the future. It's more like finding the skills that people show and being able to develop those. So those kind of skills that can be built is about communicating with people, teaching people how to write press releases, teaching people how to analyze the power of an opponent, and how to bring the best out in other people. And I've been thinking a lot about a post that I saw from a friend on social media, someone called Suki Sanga, who's an organizer in Glasgow, and she wrote a really interesting, just a piece on her own social media feed about the role of women as organizers and how a lot of men in campaign groups tend to, profit from the various kind of multitasking and sheer hard work and graft of organizing that women do. Yeah. A lot of men will come to meetings and kind of sit back and voice their opinions, but not necessarily get involved. And so there's a thick band of great women organizers in Scotland who will be the next effective group of organizers. And I think it's time to kind of celebrate and give them the due that they're worth.
I can certainly, when you talk about that nurturing role that you can have within communities to sort of draw skills out of people and develop them. I even think of my own political journey, because that's kind of what happened to me during the 2014 independence campaign. My local campaign group, Yes Clydesdale, identified that I was quite good at finding out the answers to questions and so that I could help folk on the doorsteps, and they sort of pulled that out of me and started then putting me up in front of town hall meetings to answer questions, and they got me writing about policy and politics, and well, look what happened after that.
Yeah, and it's like communities are big and diverse places, so if you've got community campaigns that involve a lot of people, there's also a really interesting thing that can happen when people involved in those campaigns switch roles. And, you know, let's say, you're involved in kind of outreach and knocking on doors for a while, but you say, hey, listen, I want to learn how to write a press release and deal with the media when we've got this upcoming action. And so those campaigns that can switch and teach people different skills, that's a really important part of that organising potential.
Yeah. And to bounce off that, I mean, how important are these community actions to policy development in the broader scope of politics? And what happens to policies if we don't use our voices and we just let the large and powerful do what they will?
It's incredibly important. You could see it from the perspective of thinking about it as a sort of two-pronged approach. You need leaders to do the right thing. And so you hope that political leaders, decision makers can help to implement policy that's good. But you also need a groundswell of support to push those issues up to the forefront. And as you were saying before, sometimes to hold those leaders to account and say it's not just during election periods that, you know, that you're going to pretend to listen to us. It's got to be all the time. But yeah, it's incredibly important. I mean, think about who has the time to kind of sit and read and understand policy and see what the sort of forthcoming trends are and changes. A lot of people in communities can't do that, but they see and feel the effects of policy on their lives, and they react to that. And sometimes that reaction is by organising together to change things. One of the other key things is also people kind of telling their own story, and stories are very important to the idea and the history of community organising, in order that people can speak about the practical changes that would help someone. They come to those realizations through often their own experiences and observations as well. But yeah, I mean, I can think of some examples of how important local community action is to the change of policy direction. Are there any that you can think of? You obviously got your head in policy a lot more than me potentially, but have there been any big kind of community groundswells that have been sort of encouraged or accelerated policy change?
I think the big one for me was the debate over fracking a few years ago. That resulted in, well, that was one of the first big political campaigns I was involved in after IndyRef. But that also resulted in a massive amount of interest from the general public. I think that was one of the most responded to consultations in the history of the Scottish Parliament. Thousands of people put in their views, almost overwhelmingly against fracking in Scotland. And I'm almost certain that if we hadn't all used our collective small voices there, then Scotland would now be fracking like mad. I think the political push at that time was a very pro-fracking push. But what we got was an indefinite moratorium against it. There is no fracking in Scotland. I think that was down to that public campaign.
Well, good on you for being part of that. Just the same as good on you for being in Kenmure St last week as well. I feel like I should make just a good example in my mind at the moment is about an action that's to come up this coming weekend, which is from Living Rent, again, that tenants organisation I mentioned. I guess I'm speaking as a member, a supporter of them, rather than a Common Weal.
Oh, Living Rent are good friends with Common Weal. We've written policy papers together, so please go.
They are. Basically my local branch is in Shawlands and Langside area of Glasgow, and there's a big development proposed at the moment in Shawlands, which is the Shawlands Arcade, a really old shopping centre. Just become run down in the last few years, but it's got shops in it. It has had community halls and centres inside that building as well. There's a big developer at the moment that's proposing to knock it down and build, it's not sure, between 300 and 600 luxury flats, 1 and 2 bed flats. No promises for social housing, certainly no promises for kind of local parking or any other amenities. And at the moment, Live in Rent are going to be carrying out an action on Saturday, actually, to basically highlight the fact that there's no social housing promised in the current development. There's been very little consultation with the public that's been effective. And so what they're doing is they're basically highlighting that there's a need to consult local residents over what they want those flats to be, and that would be a fundamental change to the housing in that area. So what will that mean for people? And I think in the wider picture of how that can impact policy development is it just draws attention back onto who has accountability for urban planning and deciding what kind of housing and what kind of people are going to be able to live in certain areas. So in those respects, it's local residents voicing frustration about something. It speaks to a much wider issue and it builds upwards from there.
I should say I love hearing these stories of community actions, not just because they're often extremely interesting stories in their own right, but I feel that they can often help overcome that confidence barrier that we were talking about earlier. And if you are sitting in your community and you see something going wrong, or you see the potential for something good and you're wondering, will this campaign work? If you can point to someone else who's already done something similar and said it worked for them, we can do this, I think that's a powerful force. So I want to make this a theme for the Common Weal Policy Podcast this year. So I'll put a call to listeners. If you are part of a community campaign or you know of one in your local area, please get in touch. I want to hear about it. I want you to come onto the show and tell your story to the rest of Scotland, so you can put that word out and you can give encouragement to other people who are doing the same. So my contact details are in the description of this podcast. Please get in touch. I want to hear from you. And very finally on this episode, what about Common Weal's Networks Coordinator? Leo, what are you going to be doing for Common Weal over the immediate period?
Superb question. Yeah, I know we've not spoken about Common Weal that much in this. So I think if you're a supporter or a subscriber or a listener to the podcast or an occasional reader of what Common Weal puts out, I think it's now time to take your commitment up to the next level if you can at the moment. And there's quite a few ways to get involved. Common Weal's just launched a campaign centre, which is basically a platform that allows supporters of Common Weal to get together, to connect with other supporters and to discuss ideas. And importantly, to get updates about what's coming out. So articles, blogs, social media posts, but also the reports, the fundamental stuff that Common Weal does. So one thing that I would encourage people to do straight away is to join Campaign Centre. You can find a link for it through the Common Weal website. And once you join, just get,
as well.
Superb. You can even add a little bit of a bio about yourself, but the most important is to interact and get involved with people. There's some big and exciting things to come out of Common Weal next week, and that includes a very large report with some fundamental things being talked about in that will impact on a lot of people. That needs shared very widely. So think about your networks, your social circles, and how we get that information out more widely. Certainly as a networks coordinator, I'll be trying to do as much as possible to encourage our supporters to do that. And I think that's my task for the next couple of weeks. And supporters can also bring others in. And I think that's key as well. So we're going to need a wide and varied movement of different people with different skills and backgrounds and social backgrounds in order to actually make these big ideas a realization. And to get these things into a policy agenda. So it's absolutely important for other people to tell each other about what Common Weal does and encourage people to sign up as supporters. And let's build that diverse and powerful movement.
Well, thank you, Leo. This has been a fascinating chat. It's been brilliant to get you onto the team and to chat to you. We've already spent the last couple of weeks sharing stories, and there's going to be more to come, I'm sure. So thanks. Please, folks, if you're already a supporter and an activist, as Leo says, let's take this up to the next level. Join the campaign centre, and we'll see if we can create more of those little voices and make them a bit louder. And I'll just finish the podcast by saying, as I always do, that Common Weal as an organisation, we're entirely supported by our activists, our volunteers, and our donors who support us with an average of £10 a month. We don't have government money. We don't get corporate funding. We don't even have adverts on our website. So we are completely reliant on our supporters, and we're completely reliant on folk buying stuff from our shop. We have some very interesting new books there, and possibly more to come in the near future. So keep an eye out on that. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Policy Podcast. Please share it, discuss it, throw it at your friends, and come back next week.